Chapter 1. The Shackle of the Stars. The planet Aspheria, a world where beauty intertwined with the sharp edge of social division, gleamed in the endless void of space. Its surface was a vibrant tapestry of lush jungles, sprawling oceans, and sweeping mountains. Yet beneath that beauty lay the harsh truth of a rigid, unyielding society that clung to its ancient traditions with a cold, iron grip. Aspheria, the jewel of the sector, had long stood as a beacon of innovation. Yet it was a beacon not of freedom but of control, a place where the powerful held dominion over the powerless, where a caste system more intricate than any found in the universe ruled every interaction, every relationship, every movement of a person's life. The rich and influential lived in the cities, high above the world's surface, in gleaming skyscrapers that shimmered like stars themselves, while the poor, the unworthy, the flawed, those who didn't meet the strict genetic and societal standards were relegated to the fringes of society, living in the shadow of the elite. Finnick Varga, a mechanic and a wanderer by nature, had never intended to get caught in the entanglements of Aspheria's deep-rooted politics. He had arrived on the planet under the pretense of being a simple worker, someone who could repair broken transports, patch up damaged starships, and keep to himself. His life had always been one of simplicity, fixing engines, troubleshooting electrical systems, and making just enough money to move to the next system where the work was more than enough to keep him fed and solvent. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. It wasn't long before Finnick realized that the planet's beauty was only skin deep. There was something unsettling about the air in Solran, the planetary capital, a sense that things were not as they appeared, that there were secrets buried in the gleaming streets, secrets kept from those who were willing to believe in the surface reality. It didn't take him long to find out what these secrets were, for Solran was the kind of city that didn't let outsiders in easily, even if they were merely here for business. There was a rigid structure to the social fabric that he had never encountered before. People were classified by their rank, by their genetic purity, and their ability to contribute to the city's glittering economy. It was a system that made Finnick uncomfortable, but it was a system that was not easy to escape once you found yourself in it. He had heard whispers in the alleys, rumors about the highborn families that ruled over Aspheria, about their secrets and their terrible practices. It was these whispers that led him to her, the woman who would change his life in ways he could never have predicted. Her name was Alara, and she was an alien. Not in the way Finnick had grown accustomed to meeting travelers from distant worlds, those who came to Aspheria for trade, or to visit, or to explore. No, Alara wasn't here by choice. She had been brought to Aspheria under the most tragic of circumstances. She had fled her homeworld, a planet in the Vyrix system, after her people were wiped out in a bloody war between warring factions. The remaining survivors, scattered across the galaxy, lived on the fringes of society, refugees who had no place to call their own. Alara had been among them, alone and abandoned, until she was taken by the Aspheria's highborn families, those who saw her not as a person, but as a valuable asset, one to be manipulated, controlled, and eventually forced into a marriage contract as part of a political alliance. Alara wasn't just an alien. She was a prisoner, and she had no idea what was to become of her in this new, oppressive world. The first time Finnick saw her, it was late at night. He was walking back to his apartment after a long day of working on the engines of a transport ship that had recently arrived from a neighboring system. His eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and his mind was numb from the work, but something caught his attention as he walked through the bustling marketplace. It wasn't her beauty, though she was stunning, even in the dim light of the street, but the way she stood apart from everyone else. She was out of place here, like a note in the wrong key. Her clothes were different, not in the sense of fashion, but in the way they seemed to hold a deeper, richer history that didn't belong to the culture of Aspheria. She wore bracelets too, one silver and one dark, made of some material that shimmered even in the low light. The bracelets were intricately designed, their surface etched with symbols he didn't understand. But it was the way her fingers lingered over them, as if they were not just adornments but shackles, that caught his eye. Finnick had never been one to pay attention to the affairs of the highborn or the political games they played, but there was something about Alara that drew him in. She looked like someone who had been broken and remade, someone who had lost everything and yet was still standing. She looked as if she was trapped by something far beyond her control, something that Finnick couldn't even begin to comprehend. Without thinking, he approached her, his curiosity getting the better of him. She didn't look up when he stopped in front of her, and for a moment, he simply stood there, unsure of what to say. But then he spoke, asking about the bracelets she wore. The question, innocent enough in its intent, felt like a small intrusion into her world of isolation. "Are you wearing those as a reminder of someone?" Finnick asked, nodding toward the silver and black bands. Alara finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with something dark and distant, as though they had seen too much, felt too much. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then she stopped herself, glancing down at the bracelets once more. Her voice, when she finally answered, was quiet, almost a whisper. "They are not reminders. They are chains," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Chains that bind me to a future I did not choose. Chains that bind me to a man I have never met." Finnick's heart skipped a beat. He knew of the bonds of marriage in Aspheria, knew that they were not always about love, but about power and politics. But hearing the words come from her lips, seeing the raw pain in her eyes, it struck him harder than he expected. He hadn't expected to find someone so hopeless in a place that seemed so perfect, so controlled. It was as if she were a bird locked in a gilded cage, too beautiful to escape, too valuable to let go. "What do you mean, a man you've never met?" Finnick asked, intrigued by her story. "The man I am bound to is one of the highborn families," she explained, her voice barely more than a whisper now. "He's a member of the ruling council. I've been promised to him in marriage as part of a political arrangement. The bracelets I wear bind me to him, and when the time comes, I'll be forced to marry him whether I want to or not." Finnick could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had seen people trapped in relationships they didn't choose, forced into obligations they could never escape. But this was different. This wasn't just an arranged marriage, it was a shackle, a tool of control. Alara had been sold into it, her life set in stone by the whims of the highborn, and now she was bound to a man she had never met, forced to live a life she did not want. "I'm sorry," Finnick said, his voice low. "I didn't know." Alara looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears that she fought to hold back. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But you don't understand. If I take off the bracelets, I will be free. But if I do that, I break the vow, and the consequences, they are worse than death." Finnick didn't know what to say. He stood there, lost in the complexity of the situation. But before he could form a response, Alara's expression shifted. Her gaze locked onto him, her eyes filled with an intensity he hadn't expected. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "If you truly want to help me, if you want to set me free, you need to marry me. You need to remove the bracelets, because only then can I be free. Please, I'm begging you." Finnick stared at her, stunned. His mind raced, the weight of her plea pressing down on him. He had never intended to become involved in something so complicated, so fraught with danger. But as he looked at her, standing there before him, pleading with all the vulnerability of someone who had lost everything, he felt something stir inside him, deep, undeniable need to protect her, to give her the freedom she so desperately craved. But what would it mean to marry her? To take on the responsibility of someone else's chains? "I don't know what to say," he whispered, unsure of what he was committing to. But deep down, he knew that something had already shifted. He had already made a decision, whether he realized it or not. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the city, Finnick knew that the story of Alara and the bracelets was far from over, and that his life was about to change forever. The city of Solran, for all its opulence and towering skyscrapers, felt more like a gilded cage than a thriving metropolis. Finnick had always considered himself a wanderer, moving from one system to another, never staying in one place for too long. It was how he preferred it. No attachments, no commitments, just the endless expanse of space before him. But now, as he stood in front of Alara, the woman who had captured his heart in a way he didn't understand, he felt like he was trapped in a world far beyond his comprehension. Her eyes locked onto his, her face still streaked with the faint traces of tears, yet her expression held a strength Finnick had not expected. The vulnerability in her plea had pierced through his walls, and now, standing there with the weight of her words hanging between them, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to step into a world far darker, and more complicated than any mechanic job he had ever taken. She didn't say anything for a long moment, her gaze steady but tinged with an underlying desperation that Finnick could feel in his bones. Alara was trapped, not just by the physical bracelets around her wrists, but by a system that saw her as nothing more than a pawn in a political game, a tool to be used, a life to be controlled. And here he was, an outsider, a man who had never before considered the intricacies of galactic politics, now standing on the precipice of something far greater than he had ever imagined. "I can't make you marry me," Finnick finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't something you can ask of me. I'm just a mechanic." Alara shook her head slowly, the soft clink of her bracelets the only sound between them. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. "If I don't marry you, if I don't break this vow, I'll never be free. I'll never see the stars again, never feel the wind on my face. I'll be nothing but a tool, a possession to be passed around. And that is worse than any fate I can imagine." Finnick felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he looked at her. He had never seen anyone speak of freedom with such intensity, with such raw need. He could see it now. She wasn't just asking him for a marriage of convenience. She was asking him for a chance at a life of her own, a life she had been denied for far too long. She was asking him to be the key to her escape, to break the chains that had bound her to a future she had never chosen. "I can't promise you anything," Finnick said, his words stumbling out, caught in the whirlwind of emotions surging within him. "But I'll help you. I'll remove the bracelets. If that's what you need, I'll do it." Alara's eyes softened, and for the briefest of moments, Finnick saw the weight of her past, her pain, lifted just a little. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them, her hand trembling as she reached for the bracelets. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means to me." Finnick's hand hovered over her wrist, uncertainty still gnawing at him. He had no idea what he was getting into, but the urgency in her voice, the need for freedom, for something more than this compelled him to move. He slowly unlatched the silver bracelet first, the cool metal sliding off with a soft hiss. As it came free, Alara flinched, as if the act itself was a small release from a life she had been trapped in for far too long. Then he reached for the black bracelet, his fingers grazing over the intricate symbols etched into its surface. For a moment, he hesitated. This bracelet had been her bond, her tie to the highborn families of Aspheria, her tether to a life she had never wanted. Removing it wasn't just an act of kindness, it was an act of rebellion, an act that would change both of their lives forever. When the final bracelet fell to the ground with a soft clink, Alara let out a shaky breath, as if the weight of 1,000 expectations had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She looked up at Finnick, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite decipher: relief, gratitude, but also fear. Fear of the unknown. "I'm free," she said softly, as though the words themselves carried a weight she had never known. "But now, there's no going back." Finnick stood there, staring down at the discarded bracelets on the ground, their gleaming surface reflecting the light around them. For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of the act hanging in the air, and then Alara's voice broke the quiet. "We need to get married," she said, her words sudden, and they seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Finnick looked at her, his heart pounding. "What?" "The vow," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not just a bond. It's a legal contract. If I remove the bracelets, I break the vow, and without the right to break it, I will be hunted down. The only way to avoid that is if I marry someone else. If we're married, I can break the contract and live freely, without fear of retribution." Finnick blinked, trying to process the magnitude of her words. "Married? But this isn't even real, Alara. We don't even know each other. I barely even know what you're asking." "I'm asking for freedom," she replied softly, her voice filled with a quiet urgency. "And I'm asking for you to be the one who helps me. To help me break the chains that have held me prisoner for so long." Finnick looked down at her, his mind spinning. He wasn't ready for marriage, not with anyone, let alone someone he had just met under such unusual circumstances. He was a mechanic, not a politician or a prince, and yet here he was, standing in front of a woman who had placed her entire future in his hands, asking for a solution he wasn't sure he was capable of providing. He hadn't been prepared for any of this, and yet somehow, deep down, he knew that walking away was no longer an option. "This is insane," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We can't just get married. This whole thing is a mess." Alara's eyes softened, her expression full of understanding. "I know. I never wanted this. But this is the only way. You're the only person who can give me that freedom. And if I don't marry you, then I'll be forced back into the life I fled from. Please, Finnick. This is the only way." Finnick stood there for a long moment, staring at her, his mind racing, heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do, but as he looked into her eyes, he saw the weight of a lifetime of pain and despair. She was trapped, and the only way out was through a marriage neither of them had asked for, but both desperately needed. He sighed, looking down at the ground. "All right," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "All right, we'll do it. But this is just the start. We'll figure out the rest together." Alara's face lit up with a mixture of relief and disbelief. She stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she took his hands in hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for believing in me." Finnick nodded, though doubt still clouded his thoughts. He didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he knew that the choice he had made would change everything. For better or for worse. He was about to become part of Alara's world, and he wasn't sure either of them was ready for what that would mean. Chapter 2. Tying the Knot. The following days passed in a blur of hurried preparations, legal consultations, and the looming weight of decisions made in the heat of desperate emotion. Finnick had never imagined himself in a situation like this, not in his wildest dreams or nightmares. He was still trying to process everything that had happened, still unsure if he was doing the right thing. But as he stood alongside Alara in the opulent ceremony hall of Solran's government district, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted within him. The weight of the bracelets that had bound Alara was now gone, replaced by a different kind of chain, a bond forged not through tradition, but through a choice. Their choice. And no matter how unprepared he felt, he knew that this was the only path forward. Alara, in her ceremonial gown, stood beside him, her face a mixture of calm and inner turmoil. The gold and silver fabric shimmered in the ambient light of the grand hall, and yet, Finnick could see the nervousness behind her eyes. This wasn't just a marriage, it was her freedom. Her life was about to change forever, and so was his. The highborn officials who had gathered to witness the ceremony seemed oblivious to the gravity of the situation. They saw it as just another political contract, a simple alliance to seal off Alara's bonds. But for Finnick and Alara, it was the beginning of something far more significant. Something neither of them could yet understand, but both of them needed. As the ceremony progressed, the words of the officiant became a blur in Finnick's mind. He had never thought of himself as a man of destiny, and yet here he was, about to marry a woman he barely knew, bound by a vow neither of them had asked for. And as he looked at Alara, he realized one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened next, they would face it together. And that, for the first time in a long while, gave him hope. The ceremony hall was silent, save for the quiet hum of the ambient lights above. The ornate marble pillars, carved with intricate designs depicting long-forgotten heroes of Aspheria, towered around them, their cold, indifferent beauty contrasting sharply with the heavy emotions swirling in the air. The officiant, a pale and expressionless official from the highborn class, stood at the front of the room, droning on in a voice that had become a mere background hum to Finnick's ears. His mind, still racing, struggled to comprehend the gravity of the situation. He was about to be married, no, not married in any traditional sense. This was an alliance forged in desperation, a bond that was born of necessity rather than love. And yet, as Alara stood beside him, her presence a calm in the storm of his thoughts, he couldn't deny the overwhelming sense that something was changing within him. The weight of her hand, resting lightly on his arm, sent a ripple of warmth through him. The bracelets were gone, no longer shackling her to the life she had been forced into. This marriage, even if it wasn't one born of romance, was her chance at freedom. And by extension, it was his too. There was no going back now. The choice had been made, and they were bound by it. Alara stood tall, her posture regal despite the turmoil that undoubtedly simmered beneath her serene facade. Finnick couldn't help but admire her strength. She had been thrust into this situation through no fault of her own, forced into a life of servitude and compliance. But now, Here she was about to take control of her future in a way she had never been able to before. Despite the strange circumstances, there was a lightness in her eyes now, a flicker of hope that had been absent the first time they had spoken. Do you, Alara of Vyrix, take Finnick Varga of Earth to be your lawfully wedded husband, to break the chains that bind you, and embrace the freedom offered by this union? The officiant's voice cut through Finnick's musings, and he turned his gaze toward Alara, who now met his eyes with a quiet intensity. Alara's hand tightened on his arm, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she spoke the words that would seal their fate. I do. Finnick wasn't sure what to expect, but the weight of the moment hit him like a wave. He had agreed to this out of necessity, out of a desire to help her. But in this moment, it felt real. This wasn't just a legal contract. It was a change of fate, a shift in the very fabric of both their lives. He looked down at her, his heart pounding, and found himself nodding before speaking. I do, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. The officiant nodded and gestured toward the rings, the symbols of their union, although Finnick felt a pang of irony. He was supposed to put a ring on her finger to signify his role in her life, but in truth, it was not him who had done the choosing. It was Alara, and by accepting her plea, he was stepping into a life that was no longer his own. This was not a choice he had ever expected to make. But here he was. The ring, forged from metal that shimmered with iridescent hues, felt cold as Finnick slid it onto her finger, his breath catching in his chest. As he did so, Alara's eyes flickered toward him full of gratitude, but also a mixture of fear and something else. She wasn't just marrying him to be free. She was marrying him because this was the only chance she had at survival. You are free, Finnick whispered, though the words felt empty in the face of all the confusion swirling around them. I've given you what you wanted, Alara. But now, what happens? Alara's lips quivered as she met his eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Now we live. The officiant finished the ceremony with formal words of blessing, sealing their union with the official stamp of Aspheria's highest court. But none of the ceremony's pomp and circumstance mattered in the end. In that moment, Finnick and Alara were no longer strangers bound by circumstance. They were something more, though they could not yet fathom the full weight of it. As they left the ceremony hall, a heavy silence fell between them. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers or the quiet between old friends. It was the silence that marked the beginning of something unknown, something neither of them had ever asked for, but had been swept into nonetheless. Alara, now fully free from the shackles of her past, turned to him with a strange look in her eyes, a mixture of vulnerability and gratitude. Thank you, she said again, her voice small but genuine. Finnick nodded, unable to find the right words to express the jumble of emotions that churned within him. He had done what she had asked of him, and in return, he had set her free. But what now? They were married no matter how unconventional or unusual that marriage was, but the weight of what lay ahead was still unclear. The city of Solran loomed before them, its towering structures a reminder that even though Alara was no longer bound by the bracelets, the forces of Aspheria's highborn families would not let her go so easily. She might have broken her chains, but the world around her was still built to keep her in place. Alara's hand slipped into his as they walked, her touch warm against his skin. What happens now? She asked, her voice soft and uncertain. Finnick turned to face her, his mind working rapidly. He had never expected to find himself in this situation, married to a woman from another world, caught up in the politics of a planet that didn't seem to care for the desires of the common folk. The question of what to do next was one he wasn't prepared for. But as he looked into Alara's eyes, he realized that he wasn't the only one who had to figure this out. Together, they would have to navigate the complexities of a world that wasn't kind to those who didn't fit its molds. I don't know, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. But we'll figure it out together. Alara smiled, a faint glimmer of hope in her eyes. Together, she repeated, as though the word itself held the key to something far greater than either of them could have imagined. Chapter 3. Unraveling the Past. The days following their impromptu marriage passed in a blur of paperwork, bureaucracy, and tension. The glittering halls of Aspheria's political elite were now both a distant memory and an ever-present threat. Alara, though no longer physically bound by the bracelets, knew that her status within the highborn society would not simply vanish. As much as the marriage had freed her from her forced bonds, it had also placed her under new scrutiny, this time as the wife of an outsider, someone who was not part of the elite world that had governed her life for so long. Finnick, for all his mechanical expertise, found himself ill-prepared for the intricacies of high society. No longer simply a mechanic working on ships, he was now caught in a game of politics, of old alliances, and of power plays that went far beyond the grease of engines and the hum of machinery. Despite his reservations, he found himself thrust into meetings, discussions, and alliances that were far above his pay grade. Alara, though free from her previous vows, had become a target of those who sought to use her as leverage, those who would stop at nothing to bring her back into their fold. Their first challenge came quickly an invitation to a formal banquet at one of the highborn estates. It was the kind of event Finnick had never imagined attending, let alone as the guest of honor. The host was a powerful matriarch, one of the many families that had once considered Alara a tool to be used for their own gain. It was a reminder to Finnick of just how precarious their situation was. The world of the elite was a game of appearances, and Alara's freedom, though hard-won, had made her a target. As they entered the grand hall, the walls adorned with portraits of powerful figures from Aspheria's storied past, Finnick couldn't help but feel out of place. The sharp, glittering eyes of the assembled guests seemed to study him, evaluating him as though he were the newest commodity to be bought and sold. They whispered among themselves, eyes flickering to Alara, who stood beside him, poised but tense. For all her calm, Finnick could see the strain in her shoulders, the way her fingers subtly clenched at her side. Alara leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. "Stay close," she whispered. "They're watching us." Finnick nodded, his hand subconsciously finding hers. He didn't understand the game they were playing, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take her away from him, no matter the cost. The evening unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Political alliances were made, smiles exchanged, and empty compliments passed from one person to the next. But beneath the surface, Finnick could feel the tension growing. The highborn families may have had the power, the wealth, and the influence, but the game was about to change. Alara was no longer a pawn in their hands. She was free, and the world, for better or for worse, was watching. Finnick took a deep breath, the weight of their new reality pressing down on him. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about a revolution, a shift in the balance of power, and it was just beginning. The banquet hall was bathed in golden light, the chandeliers hanging like stars above a sea of elegantly dressed highborn guests. Finnick felt the weight of the stairs on him like a physical presence, their eyes tracing every movement, every gesture he made, as though they were studying him not just as a person, but as an object, a curiosity. He had never been one to thrive in such settings, but here, amid the lavish wealth and the political games, he understood just how out of place he was. His simple mechanic's attire, though meticulously cleaned and tailored, could never compare to the pristine suits and gowns that adorned the guests, each a mark of status, wealth, and power. But the one thing that set him apart from the crowd wasn't his attire, but the woman standing beside him. Alara was the key to everything. She was the reason they were here, and she was the reason they were being watched so carefully. Alara stood tall and graceful, her composure flawless, but Finnick could see the subtle signs of tension in her posture, the slight rigidity in her shoulders, the way her hand clenched around the glass of wine. He could feel the invisible chains that still held her, chains that no amount of legal contracts or marriage vows could break. The truth was, she might have been free from the highborn's direct control, but the system that had ensnared her for so long wasn't so easily undone. The evening wore on, and Finnick found himself navigating through conversations with high-ranking officials and power brokers, all of them eager to make alliances with him, or perhaps, more accurately, to gauge him, to determine if he was truly worthy of being married to Alara, or if he was simply a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The glances they exchanged spoke volumes. They were testing him, seeing if he could hold his own among them, and, more importantly, whether Alara had truly chosen him, or if he was simply a temporary measure in her complex escape from the clutches of the elite. Alara had warned him that her life in this world was filled with illusions and manipulations. She had lived under the watchful eyes of the powerful families for far too long, forced to play a role, to become a mask for them to control. It wasn't just the bracelets that had bound her, but the entire system, the political games, the societal expectations, the power structures that dictated every move she made. And here, at this banquet, she was still a prisoner, despite the freedom she had gained by breaking the bonds. Her new chains were invisible, but just as real, and they were tightening as the night progressed. The whispers grew louder, and Finnick could feel the tension in the air. Alara had become a target once again, not as a prisoner of the Highborn, but as someone who had dared to break away from them. The dinner conversation took darker turns as the influential guests began to speak in coded language, hinting at alliances, rivalries, and threats that Finnick couldn't fully understand but could feel in his bones. They weren't just interested in the marriage. They were interested in control, in leveraging whatever power they could take from Alara's new position. As the night wore on, Finnick and Alara stood near the edge of the hall, watching the delicate dance of politics unfold before them. The rich, the powerful, the schemers, all of them moving in orchestrated patterns, their faces masks of civility, their eyes hungry for power. Alara's gaze shifted, her eyes narrowing as she caught the gaze of a figure across the room, an older man, draped in silver robes, his face sharp, calculating, and unmistakably familiar to her. Finnick followed her gaze and felt a chill run down his spine. The man was none other than Lord Kalen, a patriarch of one of the most powerful highborn families on Aspheria. His reputation was one of ruthless ambition, a man who would stop at nothing to expand his influence. Finnick had heard of him in passing, but he now understood that this man represented everything that Alara had been trying to escape. Kalen's eyes locked onto Alara's, and a cold smile spread across his face. The tension in the room thickened, and Finnick could see the way Alara stiffened beside him. She didn't speak, but he could feel the unease radiating from her. She knew what Kalen wanted, what all the Highborn wanted, and he could see the fear flicker behind her calm facade. He could almost hear her thoughts, even without her saying a word. This isn't over. It's only just beginning. Finnick reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. You don't have to do this. We can leave. But Alara shook her head, her expression hardening. I can't. I'm bound to this place, Finnick. Bound by blood, by power, by the past. I may have removed the bracelets, but this world still holds me captive. And Kalen has plans. He always has. Then we fight him, Finnick said, his voice firm, determined. We fight for you, for both of us. We don't let him take you. Alara looked up at him, her eyes softening for a moment. You don't understand. This isn't just about me anymore. This is about everything. If we go against Kalen, we risk everything, our lives, your freedom, everything we've fought for. Finnick's gaze hardened. I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm not running anymore. Not from him, not from anyone. Alara's lips trembled, her eyes flashing with a fierce intensity. Then we'll do this together, and we'll face whatever comes. Chapter 4, Breaking the Chains. The morning after the banquet came too quickly, the harsh light of the rising sun filtering through the grand windows of their temporary residence in Solran. The grandeur of the city around them was a stark reminder of the power that held sway over Alara's life, even after the symbolic removal of the bracelets. The world outside was beautiful, but the people who ran it were not. The game of politics, of power, had been set in motion long before Alara had made her choice, and now, it was too late to turn back. Finnick knew that the stakes had been raised, but what he hadn't anticipated was how quickly things would escalate. The moment he stepped into the Highborn's world, he had unknowingly become a pawn in a much larger game, one where the consequences of every move were severe. Kalen's eyes were fixed on Alara, and Finnick knew that the path they had chosen wasn't just about escaping the past, it was about surviving a war of wills that stretched far beyond their control. Over the next few days, Finnick and Alara prepared themselves for the inevitable conflict. Kalen's influence stretched far and wide, and he would not let Alara go easily. His schemes, his manipulations, were deeply rooted in the fabric of Aspheria's power structure. But they had a secret weapon, each other. Alara had begun to gather allies, some from within the Highborn circles, others from the ranks of the resistance that still simmered beneath the surface of Aspheria's rigid society. She had been playing a dangerous game for years, and now, with Finnick by her side, she was ready to push back. They would need to be careful, though. Every step, every decision, could mean the difference between freedom and death. The final confrontation came quicker than they expected. Kalen, ever the manipulator, had orchestrated a public trial, one that would determine Alara's fate once and for all. If she was found guilty of breaking her vow, she would be returned to him, bound by her previous contract, her life once again a commodity to be traded. Phoenix stood by her side, watching as the trial unfolded before them. The highborn judges, their faces cold and impartial, looked down on Alara as if she were nothing more than a piece in a game they had long since won. But Finnick could see the fire in her eyes, the determination that had carried her this far. As the trial wore on, Finnick's heart pounded in his chest. Every word, every accusation thrown at Alara seemed like a blow to his very soul. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew that this was a battle of wits, a game that required more than just brute force. And then, just as the verdict was about to be delivered, Alara stood tall, her voice ringing out across the courtroom. I am no longer bound by this system, by these chains. I choose my own path. The room fell silent. Kalen's eyes narrowed, but Alara's resolve was unwavering. You will not take me back. I will not be your pawn any longer. Fennec stepped forward, standing by her side, his hand resting on her shoulder. She's right. We're done playing by your rules, Kalen. The courtroom erupted into chaos, but for the first time, Fennec felt the weight of the past fall away. The battle was not over, but they had won this round. Alara was free, truly free, not just from her bracelets, but from the chains that had bound her for so long. As they left the courtroom, Alara looked at Finnick, her eyes filled with gratitude, but also something deep and enduring. They had made it through the storm, together, and now, with the world at their feet, they could face whatever came next. Together.